A project that I assisted with, which was just starting at the time, was a project looking at installing different types of insulation into a tenement housing building. And it was really measuring the humidity and thermal transmittance and trying to verify manufacturers' U-value claims. So I think this work is undertaken by Historic Scotland is really important because it will really show how traditional buildings materials compare in relation to other materials and whether the manufacturer's claims actually stack up. This study was looking at the tenements prior to being occupied and then through a heating period while occupied. A project that had been completed with the Edinburgh World Heritage Trust and Changeworks was a project on a heritage-listed tenement in Edinburgh, and they produced a guide for improving the energy efficiency of these types of buildings. And the second stage was a project that looked at the installation of solar thermal panels on the roof and a guide to microgeneration. And I was kind of interested in this because it was very controversial. The roofscape of Edinburgh, of anyone who's been there, is very evident from Edinburgh Castle. Any changes to the roofscape are very contentious. So you'll see that these have been installed on an internal roof, inside of roof space, or an internal valley. I was interested that solar thermal panels, were quite controversial in a lot of places that I visited. The National Trust, this is their headquarters in Swindon, which is actually a building built in 2005. They're very proud of this. This uses extensive use of photovoltaic panels and timber from the Trust estates. But they have a very large and broad property portfolio in the UK, and they've undertaken renewable energy installations at a range of properties. But I was interested in the fact that it would not be applicable to all organisations because the Trust, by its nature, has access to large areas of land for geothermal systems, for instance, and forested estates for biomass wood pellet, chip and log boilers, etc. So where the Trust could pursue some of those renewable energy solutions, it wouldn't be applicable for some other building owners. I found in the USA and Canada, though, that heritage agencies don't have the same research focus, but there's an increasing recognition of the importance of the integration of historic preservation and sustainability. And there's increasing dialogue between green building advocates and preservation advocates. In the USA, heritage preservation is guided by the Secretary of the Interior Standards, and there was a lot of discussion when I was there about whether the standards need to be revised to address sustainability issues. But the current thinking seems to be that the standards are green-friendly, and what is needed is greater interpretation and clearer and more comprehensive guidelines to ensure their consistent application. However, I've since been sent a survey about whether the standards should change, so it's obviously a debate that's still ongoing. And in Canada, I should say that they have a similar document, but it's called the Standards and Guidelines for the Conservation of Historic Places in Canada, which underpins practice there. In Canada, the Public Works and Government Services Canada has provided leadership in the development of heritage conservation and social cultural metrics for use in green rating tools, as well as developing guidelines. However, they're only for government use, and they only were developed to draft form. Before they decided, their original intention was to develop a standalone tool for their use, but they realised that wasn't the way to go. But it was interesting, the work that they've done on looking at those metrics. I think it has been very valuable. Parks Canada's also undertaken life cycle assessment studies of embodied effects for existing historic buildings, and that was an interesting study in that they looked at 4 buildings. They were considering the environmental implications of demolishing the buildings compared to building similar sized buildings anew. And they were looking at the avoided, what they've termed the avoided environmental impact. It produced mixed results. One of the buildings produced quite a low avoided environmental impact, whereas some of the other buildings were quite high. Much of the activity in the USA and Canada is surrounding the design of green rating tools and how they represent historic preservation concerns. In the USA, the Sustainable Preservation Coalition has been formed, which is an umbrella organisation for a range of government and non-government organisations, and they're in dialogue with the Green Building Council in the USA about the design of LEED tools. They're particularly concerned about how standards used in the tools are applied to historic buildings, and there's been a great deal of criticism about the design of the rating tools. This includes that the rating tools are highly prescriptive and weak on performance measures. They overlook the impact of cultural value. They do not effectively consider performance, longer service life and embodied energy. There should be more weighting to life cycle analysis indicators. A few points are given for saving historic building materials. However, points are given for recycling demolished materials or salvaging materials. Points are not given when historic buildings are inherently energy efficient. Restricting water usage can be a concern for some landscapes. Rating tools differ in the weighting and importance of individual categories, and they have become measures of how we consume rather than asking questions such as how much do we consume or should we consume. However, there have been some recent lead developments, one being interesting or encouraging, where they're looking at an alternate compliance path being developed which will benefit existing buildings, entitled the Life Cycle Assessment of Building Assemblies. And this will be an optional path to use in the materials and resources category. And also they've introduced a LEED neighbourhood development tool. The SPC, Sustainable Preservation Coalition, has suggested a range of performance metrics which would more appropriately address preservation concerns. These include reduced carbon footprint of the construction process by acknowledging the avoided impacts that are avoided by the reuse of materials, reduced carbon footprint of operations and livability, durability of historic materials, and life cycle flexibility, which recognises the multiple reuses an historic building may be used for over its service life. And there was also a lot of discussion about envelope performance, and this is one project I sort of looked at when I was there. The Toronto Mayor's St Jamestown Tower Renewal project is looking at these high-rise housing projects and looking at the sustainability issues associated with that type of building. And it lends itself, and then the discussion evolves into, well, if you're looking at insulation, for instance, to the exterior of the building, you're affecting the architectural values. And is that compatible with, if they were historic towers, heritage registered towers, is that compatible with maintaining the heritage significance of those sort of buildings, that type of building? So the observations of my, my fellowship were that the environmental merit of retaining and conserving older buildings seems obvious, but it appears difficult to prove without access to appropriate data and tools. Indicators, measurements and scientific data are important in the sustainability field, but heritage conservation is traditionally weak in scientific data and measurement. There are significant gaps in existing green rating tools which do not address social and cultural indicators of sustainability for some of those reasons I've mentioned, and that decisions about whether to keep or demolish a building often revolve around cost considerations. And I think the Parks Canada example of looking at the avoided environmental impact is something that's quite worthwhile to consider. So if anyone's interested in looking at the Queensland Heritage Strategy, it's available on the DERM website or the Queensland Heritage Council website. And applications for current 2012 Churchill Fellowships close in February, and you can go to the Churchill website for information on Churchill Fellowships. Thank you.
I think a fair indication there that it's not just a free trip.